Hello, welcome to Workplace Wake Up. I'm Jen Shaw. Every week, I spend about 15 minutes covering key legal developments, introducing you to interesting guests, and providing some entertainment to start your workday. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Workplace Wake Up. Wow. Somebody asked me the other day, why did you name your podcast that? And I started to tell the story of how during COVID, we all had those Wednesday morning calls that were free to you guys. And we talked about all of the crazy COVID stuff that was driving us all to drink. And this person looks at me and she said, I'm so glad I wasn't in HR when that happened. I said, yeah, no doubt. You have no idea how we were running around like crazy. And it really got me thinking about how we'd all think we had it right. And then they'd issue some new directive or new memo. And we're like, you've got to be kidding me. So I'm so glad we're not doing that anymore. We are going to talk today about criminal history inquiries. Now, I want you to understand that there's a bit of social engineering going on here. For many jobs, most jobs, I think, somebody's criminal history background is important, right? Whether you run a law firm, you run a convenience store, you run a taxi cab company, whatever, you want to know if somebody has been, incarcerated for murder. Like, that's important to you, right? You want to know. Now, I will tell you, the very first time I ran across this issue, I was a baby lawyer at a very big international law firm, and they asked me to interview a candidate for a mailroom position. And I was very excited because I'd just been added to the employment law group. I had previously been a bond lawyer in the public finance department with a lot of great people. I loved it. But Trish Higgins, who works with Shaw Law Group now, was in the employment law department at this firm. And she said to me, Jen, I have this crazy investigation I want you to do involving the grocery store and sex toys and all kinds of stuff. Can you do it? And I thought, well, how could I turn that down? So yes, of course I did it. And that's when I became an employment lawyer. So I'm asked to interview this guy to work in our mailroom. And I guess they had had several interviews and they didn't like anybody. So there was a big partner meeting and they said, okay, we can't interview this guy when the agency's sending him over, Jen, but you go interview him. So I didn't know what to do. There was no, by the way, Google. I couldn't Google, like, what do you ask someone to do in an interview? This was 1994. And so I thought, okay, well, I'm just going to look at his resume and his application. So I look at the resume, look at the application. The guy comes in, he looks very clean cut, well, nice guy. And so we're talking about his resume and his employment history. And I noticed there was a big gap in his history. And I said, oh, so where were you, for this 7-year period? It's a pretty long period. He said, well, I was in Folsom. And I said, oh, you were in Folsom, like you lived in Folsom? You mean right by us? He goes, no, I was at the prison. I said, oh, you worked at the prison. No, I was in the prison. Well, now I am fascinated. The old Harriet the Spy in me has been kicked in. And of course, I had to say to him, oh my gosh, what did you do? He said he drove a getaway car for a bank robbery. Okay, how exciting is this, right? So I start asking him, well, what'd you do? Like, how'd you know where to park? And how'd you know where to go? And oh my gosh, this is incredible. So I get all this information about the crime. So I tell him, thanks so much for meeting with me. It was so great to meet you. I'm going to recommend your hiring. And I go back to the partner and I tell him, I interviewed this guy. He's great. Did you know something? He was the getaway driver during a bank robbery. Now, my view was, it was 10 years before. Big deal. All right, we all make mistakes, right? Give the guy a job. He's working in the mailroom. That's fine. The partner went ashen, right? And said, Jen, what are you talking about? Like, how did you find out he had been in prison? I said, well, I asked about this gap in his resume. And anyway, you can see where this is going, right? I asked about 400 questions I wasn't supposed to ask. Interestingly, the firm ended up hiring this guy. And as far as I know, he's still there. He was a fabulous employee. So just because somebody has a criminal history doesn't mean they're not going to be a great employee. But having said that, I understand why employers want to know whether someone they're interviewing or considering for hiring may have something in their background check that would give the employer pause. So first thing to know is that employers have the right to do a criminal background check in California. Many states have no rule on this issue, which means you can do anything. Some states have limiting rules like we do here in California. But even in California, you can do a background check. Now, what does a background check include? Well, it may include criminal or arrest records, workers' compensation records, DMV driving or vehicle registration records, educational history, job history, etc. Now, what you have to know in California is that there are a number of laws that regulate your ability to ask applicants, or in some situations, current employees, about their criminal history. First of all, you've got California's Ban the Box law, all right? There are also many local ordinances, for sure, in Los Angeles and San Francisco. There's also the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act. There's the California Information Privacy Act. There's the California Investigative Consumer Reporting Agencies Act. There are a whole bunch of laws out there that allow employers to gather this information, but it has to be done so appropriately. And that's where things get a little bit tricky. Now, a couple of months ago, we got new regulations from the California Civil Rights Department. Remember, they used to be called the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. And they're limiting what we call this Fair Chance Act. And by the way, this is also referred to as Ban the Box, right? It's the reason they call it that is many employers used to have a box on the application for employment saying, check this box if you have a criminal history. But there are so many laws in California. You have to be sure you're not asking for crimes that are more than 7 years old. You have to make sure you're not asking for information about crimes or convictions that have been expunged, so wiped out by the court, or dismissed upon condition of probation. These are in Labor Code Section 432.7. There are also a number of procedures you have to follow under the Federal Fair Credit Reporting Act and the Investigative Consumer Reporting Agencies Act here in California, the ICRRA. So you got to have a right process here. So the first thing to ask yourself is, okay, am I going to do background checks? Do I care about this information? And I know for many of you, you might be thinking, well, of course we care about the information, Jen. I mean, why wouldn't we? Because there's a lot of work you have to do to get it. And once you get it, there's a lot of work you have to do to be able to use it. So something you can't use, you can't just bop on over to the Megan's Law database and see if somebody's on the database. Illegal. Can't use it. What do you do once you know about it? Well, you can't unknow about it. But you may not want to hire that person now. Well, you got to decide if you're going to take the risk. So there are so many requirements. You need to have a process that you're following internally to make sure that every law I mentioned a few minutes ago is fully reflected and that you are taking steps to ensure you are complying with each of those laws. Criminal history tends to be used in a discriminatory manner. This is why the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is so protective of this information. And it's also, of course, why California and other states are as well. Unfortunately, men, as opposed to women and people of color, tend to be convicted at a higher rate than other folks. That means males who are people of color are likely to have criminal background histories. And if we allow a law that says somebody who just has a criminal background history, in other words, they have a conviction or they spend time in jail, whatever it may be, we don't have to hire them. We're not going to have a law like that because there are too many public policy issues out there. There are too many reasons why many lawmakers and agency administrators have said, no, that's not right. It's not fair. And actually, I agree with that. I feel like there are many things that people may do in their youth, or they may do that there might be some sort of extenuating circumstance that would not make them unemployable. The good news about all of these laws is that you ultimately get to decide if you don't want to employ someone or you don't want to continue employing someone because of something that happened in their criminal background. So you do have options. Nobody's going to make you hire someone who you don't want to hire, but you've got to follow the right processes. And what this brings us to is using third-party entities to conduct those background checks. Most people do that, and they should use a third party because it's much better to have just a neutral third party going through and gathering that information. But when you use a neutral third party, you've got to make sure you're complying with the law. That's really important. So when we think about what vendor you're going to use, you got to make sure they have forms that comply with the law where you are. So not just California law maybe, but if you're in LA, you need one that complies with LA rules and ordinances. So you've got to make sure that they're going to follow all of the procedures. They're going to help you follow the procedures. Remember, we have things like pre-adverse action letters and adverse action letters, and you have to give notice to the applicant and let them contradict or provide information to show that the report is invalid or it has inappropriate information. There's so much going on here that you've got to make sure you dot your I's and cross your T's. This is not a place for shortcut, which is why you may decide you don't want to do it. You just don't want to go through the hassle of the forms you have to give and the boxes that have to be checked and the way you have to provide a copy of the report. You just may not want to do it. And I get it. I will tell you, for most employers, you should do it. For most employers, you don't want to be on the hook when somebody says, oh, you hired Jen Shaw. Didn't you know she embezzled $1 million from her last employer? Well, you would have known if you did a background check. Right? Now, I work with a lot of CEOs of financial institutions who say to me, I don't like all these limitations. I don't want to only go back 7 years. I don't want to not know about something just because it's been expunged or someone happened to pay their penalty and so it's been wiped out. I've got to know these people have integrity. I get it. But many of these laws impose very, very stringent requirements on the employers. So you may decide to take a risk. If you work with us on legal issues, you know that I never judge you for not wanting to follow my advice. That's really irrelevant in my opinion. I give you the advice. I only give you advice I know to be accurate. And if you decide that you don't want to follow my advice, that's okay. I don't take it personally. I don't have any ego in it. It's fine. So you may decide, yeah, Jen, we hear you, and we're not going to do anything that you're telling us to do about background checks. That's fine. That's cool. Just take the risk. If you want to make sure you're compliant, though, you need to pick the right vendor. And I want to make sure that you're asking all the right questions about compliance with the law where you are. Also, of course, with all this remote work that's going on, compliance with where the applicant or employee may reside as well, and where they may be doing their work, which could be 3 different places, right? Where you are, where they live, and where they work. So it's very important to understand that. The other thing is you need to do training on this issue. Not necessarily the nuts and bolts, because human resources is generally going to be dealing with that, or personnel, or whichever department it may be, depending on where you work. But when you're looking at this from a training perspective, I want you to train leaders not to have bias around background checks and around criminal history. It is very hard to do. I think when people say, I don't have any bias, it reminds me of this woman who once told me, I'm a really good team player. And she ended up being a disaster, horrible to work with. She was nothing like a team player ever. And I should have known, if you have to say, I'm a good team player, you're probably not a great team player. Somebody told me there's no I in team, but there is an M and an E. And boy, this person knew it right off the bat. You have to know what you're doing as a leader. And when you're going to be making hiring decisions, I know HR may do all the nuts and bolts. They may get all the paperwork. But if you're a leader or manager, you've got to know where you cannot step. And background check histories are a big part of that process. You've got to understand what you can ask and what you can't, what information you're entitled to, how you share that information, who else you can tell that information to. There are a ton of rules in this area. So we are going to cover these rules in our webinar on June 27th. We're going to do an hour-and-a-half webinar on all of this criminal history mess. It's on June 27th. You can go on the website to sign up for it. I want you to, in the meantime, take a look at your processes, your procedures. Make sure you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's and you're doing things the way you should be. If you have questions, ask your employment lawyer. They should know it off the top of their head what these rules are and how to comply with them. So I know it's a lot, everyone, but you can do this and we have to do this. We want to be fair to people who have criminal histories, but also make sure that we're keeping our workplace safe. So thank you for listening today. Send your comments and suggestions to jshaw@shawlawgroup.com or info@shawlawgroup.com. Thanks, everyone. Go out and make it a great day. Workplace Wake Up, including our guests and hosts, do not provide legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to spread the word, please share it with others, post about it on social media, and/or rate and review it. You can also follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, and email us at info@shawlawgroup.com.